Welcome to American War. Today we're diving deep into one of the most pivotal moments in United States history, the Battle of Gettysburg. This epic clash didn't just change the course of the American Civil War, it defined the future of an entire nation. In this video, you'll immerse yourself in bold strategies, fateful decisions, and sacrifices that shaped the destiny of millions. We'll unpack the triumphs and blunders of legendary leaders like Robert E. Lee and George Meade, while exploring the war tactics and human stories that brought this conflict to life. Watching this video will help you understand how military history teaches us valuable lessons about leadership, courage, and the impact of decisive choices. Stick with me until the end and discover how Gettysburg became the stage for a battle that echoed through the centuries. In December 1862, the Confederates repelled a major invasion of Virginia, winning at Fredericksburg. This victory boosted Southern morale and opened doors for potential negotiations with European powers. Later in May 1863, Lee secured another brilliant victory at the Battle of Chancellorsville, employing daring tactics and the legendary command of Stonewall Jackson. However, this victory came at a cost. Jackson, struck by friendly fire, succumbed to his wounds, leaving Lee without his top strategist. Despite the loss, Confederate morale was high. Lee saw the perfect moment to shift the war's momentum. He decided to take the conflict into enemy territory, causing despair among the Northerners. His plan was audacious: break the Union lines in Pennsylvania, destroy their armies, and force international recognition of Southern independence. In June 1863, Lee and his army of 75,000 men crossed the Potomac River and invaded the North. Against them was the Army of the Potomac, with 93,000 soldiers, led by Joseph Hooker, a reluctant commander. Lee's strategy rested on risky assumptions. He believed the North was as worn down by the war as the South. Furthermore, his cavalry, led by Jeb Stuart, was less effective than expected. Stuart focused on engagements and raids, neglected the vital work of reconnaissance and protecting communication lines. On June 9th, the mythical Confederate cavalry was surprised by the Union at Brandy Station in the largest cavalry engagement of the war. For the first time, the myth of the invincible rebel horseman was shattered. The battle ended inconclusively, but was a significant moral blow to Stuart. As Lee advanced through the North, his cavalry failed to provide critical intelligence. The Confederate army was vulnerable and, unknowingly, closely followed by the Army of the Potomac. After disagreements with Lincoln, Hooker was replaced by General George Meade, who took command just days before Gettysburg. In the small town of Pennsylvania, the paths of the two armies would finally cross. Gettysburg, with its open fields and strategic elevations, would be the stage for a battle that would change the course of American history. In the next chapters of this incredible journey, we'll see how the courage, strategy, and mistakes of both sides led to a clash of epic proportions. Gettysburg wasn't just a battle, it was a definitive test for the leadership, the soldiers, and the destiny of a divided nation. Now take your place on the front lines, because history is about to be written before your very eyes. The absence of Jeb Stuart and his cavalry on the front lines had a direct impact on the Confederate strategy. Confederate morale, which depended on Stuart's invincible reputation, was shaken. He spent the rest of the campaign trying to restore his image, but Stuart's erratic behavior left Lee in a vulnerable position. Without accurate information, the Confederate army advanced blindly, ahead of its enemies, generating panic in Pennsylvania, while believing that the Army of the Potomac was far enough away not to pose an immediate threat. But the reality was different. The Union Army, led by Joseph Hooker, followed closely. Despite being a hesitant commander, whose indecision was decisive for the defeat at Chancellorsville, Hooker kept the army moving. However, after a heated confrontation with other commanders on June 27th, Hooker submitted his resignation as an act of provocation. To his surprise, Abraham Lincoln accepted it immediately, appointing Brigadier General George Meade as the new commander of the Army of the Potomac. Meade, a temperamental man involved in political intrigue, took on the challenge with determination. He and General Sickles, although political adversaries, would have crucial roles in the events to come. At the end of June, Lee decided to concentrate his force around the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On June 30th, a Confederate detachment arrived in the town in search of supplies, especially shoes, as the soldiers were exhausted after long marches. However, as they approached, the Confederates spotted Federal troops and Yankee cavalry nearby. For Lee, who had not received reports indicating that the Union had crossed the Potomac. This seemed unlikely. He assumed that the forces cited were just local militias, underestimating the enemy presence. On the hot, dry morning of July 1, 1863, Confederate troops under General Heth advanced towards Gettysburg. However, resistance came sooner than expected. General John Buford, leading a small detachment of Union cavalry, had already strategically positioned his forces, understanding that the elevation south of the town would be crucial to the outcome of the battle. Knowing he couldn't win alone, Buford sent alerts to the Army of the Potomac, fighting bravely to buy time until reinforcements arrived. Gettysburg, a typically rural town, became the epicenter of a historic battle. With pastures, wheat fields, orchards, and strategically positioned hills, the terrain offered advantages to whoever managed to dominate it. The prominent elevations were Seminary Ridge to the west and Cemetery Hill to the south. Nearby, rock formations like the Devil's Den and the Round Top and Little Round Top Hills added complexity to the battlefield. As the sound of combat echoed in the distance, General Longstreet observed Lee, who seemed dejected. "I should have heard something from Stuart," Lee murmured, aware that he was advancing without reliable information. "It may be the whole Union Army or just a detachment. If it's the whole Federal force, we must fight here." The battle that was beginning in Gettysburg would not just be another confrontation. It would define the fate of a divided nation. Lee, troubled by the lack of information from Stuart, reflected with a mix of frustration and apprehension. "I can't imagine what might have happened to Stuart. I should have received news from him already. He may have encountered disaster, but I hope not. Without reports, I am in the dark about what we face here. It may be the whole Federal Army or just a detachment. If it is the whole Federal force, then we must fight the battle here." The Confederates, initially confident, quickly realized that the soldiers in front of them were not a simple militia, but the legendary Iron Brigade, a name that evoked respect and fear for their bravery in combat. General John Buford, leading a small detachment of cavalry, knew that the elevation south of Gettysburg would be crucial. He decided to resist until reinforcements arrived, aware that allowing the Confederates to take those positions without resistance could seal the fate of the Union. As the Confederates advanced, the Federal Brigade suffered significant losses, with some units losing almost half of their men. Reinforcements arrived from both sides, transforming the battle into a fierce confrontation. A chaplain from New York described the march to the battlefield. "We were marching as fast as possible under the scorching July heat. We were sweating so much that my clothes couldn't have been wetter, even if I had dived into a lake." Despite the heroic efforts of the Unionists to hold Seminary Ridge, the Confederate numerical superiority began to weigh. The battle continued throughout the morning until the Federals retreated into the city. Even so, the Confederates did not pursue the retreating soldiers, hesitating to disobey Lee's orders to avoid large-scale confrontations. On the front lines, General John Reynolds led his men with passion, shouting, "Forward, men, in God's name, get them out of the woods." But in a fateful instant, Reynolds was struck in the head and died instantly. Command passed to General Doubleday, who managed to maintain resistance. With reinforcements under General Ewell, the Confederates renewed their attacks in the early afternoon, forcing the fight into Gettysburg. Some Federal units collapsed and fled south, creating a breach in the Union lines. However, General Howard took positions on Cemetery Hill, regrouping the retreating soldiers and establishing a solid defense. Lee ordered Ewell to attack Cemetery Hill, but with the instruction to avoid a widespread confrontation. Reluctantly, Ewell did not launch the attack, and the first day ended before 4 p.m. Meanwhile, General George Meade, the newly appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac, was 15 kilometers from Gettysburg when he received news of Reynolds' death and the ongoing battle. He immediately ordered all forces to concentrate on the city, arriving at Cemetery Hill after midnight already on July 2nd. On the morning of the second day, both armies were in position. Lee commanded 75,000 men, including 9,500 cavalry, with Stuart still absent, and 270 artillery pieces. The Unionists had 95,000 soldiers, 360 artillery pieces, and 10,000 cavalry. Meade established a hook-shaped defensive line, ensuring rapid movement of reinforcements between positions. Lee rejected Longstreet's suggestion to bypass the Union forces to cut their supply lines, opting for a direct attack. Longstreet was tasked with attacking the left flank, while Ewell was to pressure the right flank at Culp's Hill, and Hill would keep the center occupied to prevent reinforcements. At noon, General Sickles, acting without Meade's permission, advanced his forces towards the Peach Orchard, creating a dangerous gap in the Union line. At 4 p.m., Longstreet launched his attack with a devastating 30-minute bombardment. The intense fighting spread to Devil's Den and Little Round Top, where troops led by Joshua Chamberlain made a desperate defense. Out of ammunition, Chamberlain commanded a bayonet charge that surprised the Confederates, saving the position. Meanwhile, at the Peach Orchard and the wheat field, the forces clashed in brutal combat, with positions changing hands repeatedly. Despite the devastating losses, Union reinforcements kept the line stable. At the end of the second day, the Confederates launched a final attack on Little Round Top, but were repelled. After 3 hours of fierce fighting, 14,000 men were dead or wounded. Although the Confederates had gained some ground, the Union maintained its strategic positions. The Battle of Gettysburg was far from over, but the determination of both sides promised an even bloodier third day. Lee, frustrated with the lack of accurate information due to the absence of Stuart and his cavalry, reflected on the situation he faced. Without reliable reports, he was not sure what lay ahead. It could be the entire Federal Army, or just a detachment. Lee expressed his uncertainty and resignation, stating that if it was the entire Union Army, the battle should be fought there. The Confederates were surprised to discover that the soldiers faced in Gettysburg were not a simple local militia, but the renowned Iron Brigade. Known for their bravery and resistance, the brigade was a symbol of tenacity for the Union. General John Buford, commander of the cavalry, realized the strategic importance of the elevation south of the city and did everything he could to resist until the arrival of reinforcements led by General John Reynolds. As the Confederates pressed the improvised defenses of the Unionists, entire Union brigades suffered heavy casualties, with some losing up to half of their men. Reinforcements from both sides arrived constantly, increasing the intensity of the clash. An Army chaplain described the march to the battlefield as exhausting, mentioning that the July heat caused the soldiers to sweat so much that their clothes were completely soaked. Even with the arrival of reinforcements, the numerical superiority of the Confederates began to weigh. The Union troops retreated to the city, but were not pursued, as the Confederate commanders hesitated to disobey Lee's order to avoid major clashes. During the retreat, General John Reynolds, the highest-ranking Union commander at the time, personally led his men in the defense of the city. He was fatally shot while shouting for his troops to advance. With the death of Reynolds, command passed to General Doubleday, who continued the resistance. However, the Confederates, now reinforced by General Ewell, renewed the attacks and managed to force the fight into Gettysburg. Some Federal units collapsed and fled, but General Howard reorganized the soldiers at Cemetery Hill, establishing a defensive line crucial to the continuation of the battle. Meanwhile, General George Meade, the newly appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac, received news of the battle while only 10 miles from Gettysburg. He ordered the entire army to converge on the town, arriving at Cemetery Hill shortly after midnight on July 2nd. By the morning of the second day, both armies were prepared. Lee commanded approximately 75,000 men, including 9,500 cavalry and 270 artillery pieces, while Meade led 95,000 troops, 360 artillery pieces, and 10,000 cavalry. Meade organized his forces into a defensive, fishhook-shaped line, allowing for rapid reinforcements between positions. Despite Longstreet's suggestions for a flanking maneuver to cut off Union supply lines, Lee insisted on a direct assault. He ordered Longstreet to attack the left flank at Little Round Top, while Ewell would pressure the right flank at Culp's Hill, and Hill would keep the center occupied. At noon, General Sickles, without Meade's approval, advanced his forces towards the Peach Orchard, creating a dangerous gap in the Union defensive line. At 4 p.m., Longstreet initiated his attack with a devastating 30-minute artillery barrage. Fierce fighting spread through Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard, and Little Round Top. At Little Round Top, Confederate troops faced a desperate defense led by Joshua Chamberlain. Running out of ammunition, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge that surprised the Confederates, securing the position for the Union. Meanwhile, in the Peach Orchard and the wheat field, fighting was equally intense, with positions changing hands repeatedly. Despite heavy casualties, timely reinforcements ensured the stability of the Union lines. Late in the day, the Confederates attempted a final assault on Little Round Top, but were repelled. After 3 hours of bloody combat, approximately 14,000 men were dead or wounded. As the second day of battle concluded, the Union maintained its strategic positions while the Confederates faced the weight of their losses and the challenge of an impending third day. The Battle of Gettysburg was far from over, and both sides knew that the fate of the war could be decided in the next 24 hours. The forest around Culp's Hill was dense, with almost no visibility. The attacker moved like a shadow, as invisible as the defender. Minutes seemed like hours to the soldiers, with their pale faces, wide eyes, and trembling hands gripping loaded muskets. The tension peaked until finally, the initial assault succeeded. Some trenches were taken in bloody, frenzied hand-to-hand combat. However, Union reinforcements coming from the interior lines once again saved the day. Among the many losses of that tragic moment was the young Colonel Avery, mortally wounded in the neck. He fell from his horse as the chaos of battle raged around him. In his last moments, with a pencil, he wrote on a blood-stained piece of paper, "Tell my father that I died with my face to the enemy." Days later, his body was found, along with the message that would become a symbol of bravery and sacrifice. On the night of July the 2nd, the attack on Culp's Hill began in full force. The troops that had previously reinforced Little Round Top were no longer in the trenches on the right. This left approximately 1,300 Union soldiers to face 4,500 Confederates. By 10 p.m., the empty trenches were occupied by the Confederates, but exhausted, the fighting finally ceased. In just 2 days, 37,000 men were dead or wounded, and Gettysburg had yet to see its worst moment. In the early hours of July 3rd, the battle resumed. For 7 hours, the forces clashed in brutal fighting. Union reinforcements, including soldiers who had defended Little Round Top, arrived to reinforce the right flank, finally securing the position. The fighting, however, was far from over. At noon, Robert E. Lee plotted his next move. He ordered a massive bombardment. 150 Confederate cannons fired upon the Union lines, who responded with 170 artillery pieces. It was the largest cannon duel ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere. However, George Meade, anticipating Lee's plan, ordered his cannons to cease fire, creating the illusion that the Union guns had been destroyed. Lee fell into the trap and ordered a frontal assault with 12,000 men led by General George Pickett. Under a scorching sun, the Confederates marched towards the Union lines. What followed was a storm of fire. Artillery and muskets devastated the rebel ranks, mowing down entire regiments. The attack culminated in a fierce struggle at the stone wall, where the Confederates, despite brief advances, were repelled. Half of the men who participated in Pickett's charge did not return. What could have been Lee's great opportunity became his most terrible defeat. While the attack on the center failed, Jeb Stuart led a cavalry raid to try to cut off Union supply lines. However, the charge was repelled by a countercharge led by the young General George Custer. As night fell on July 3rd, the Battle of Gettysburg came to an end. The next day, Lee waited for a counterattack that never came. Overnight, the Confederate Army began its retreat, carrying miles of wounded in wagons. Gettysburg became the largest conflict of the American Civil War, with 51,000 men dead, wounded, captured, or missing. The victory gave the Union hope that the war could finally be won. For the South, the result marked the beginning of a desperate struggle for survival, which would drag on for another 21 months. The residents of Gettysburg, deeply scarred by the devastation, decided that the soldiers who fought and died should be buried in the land that had taken their lives. Thus, the first national cemetery in the United States was created. In November 1863, Abraham Lincoln visited Gettysburg to dedicate the cemetery and delivered his famous address. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. And so the Battle of Gettysburg concludes, but the lessons it leaves us echo to this day. What would you do if you were in Lee's place? Would you make the same decisions, or risk a completely different strategy? And Meade? Could he have ended the war right there with a bolder counterattack? Stories like this show us the power of strategic decisions and how they shape the fate of nations and people. What other moment in the history of American wars would you like to explore? Leave your opinion and questions in the comments. If you want to continue unraveling the mysteries and lessons of the greatest battles in American history, subscribe now to American War and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Here, history comes to life, and you become a part of it. Until next time.